All right, good evening and welcome to episode one of Legal Fate and Mental State. I'm your host, Richard Rodriguez. I'm a New York attorney with over 16 years of experience. I currently serve as COO and General Counsel of a mental health practice in Connecticut, and I'm joined by my wife and co host, Denise Santangelo. Denise?
I'm the co-host of Legal Fate and Mental State. My name is Denise Santangelo. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist and a doctoral candidate in psychology and a former New York litigator. So I have an interesting background. On this podcast, I'm going to help us look beyond the courtroom headlines. And I want to be able to help all of you explore the psychology underneath each case. You know, the mental health conditions involved, the motivations and the behavioral patterns that are at play, and just essentially how a person's psychological functioning may or may not affect their criminal responsibility. And I think this case that's going on right now, the Commonwealth versus Clancy, Lindsay Clancy, is a really good case for us to get this started.
Yeah, and I think obviously if you're in this space, if you're in the law tuber space, you know the background already. Everybody's been watching this case, everybody's been following it. Yesterday, July 27th, depending on when you're watching this, we had opening statements and we had the beginning of evidence with the direct testimony or the beginning of the direct testimony of Patrick Clancy. So I figure we'll start there. We'll break down a little bit of what we thought about the opening from both the ADA, the Commonwealth, and defense counsel. We can talk a little bit about sort of where the initial direct went with Patrick Clancy, and we can kind of forecast a little bit what to expect tomorrow when they pick up on direct. And I would suspect cross of Patrick Clancy.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because there's so much coming on this case, like before opening statements yesterday, where there's so much talk about Lindsay Clancy's diagnoses before, she went ahead and killed her 3 kids and tried to jump out the second floor window and take her own life. And as the opening statements unfolded, we started to really learn a lot more about, where this is kind of going to go with a lot more of this postpartum psychosis diagnosis, which is a really interesting one because most people know about postpartum depression. We hear about that kind of a lot, and it's a very serious diagnosis and a very real thing that a lot of women who experience after having children. But postpartum psychosis, even though it has the, whole first beginning word, is actually 2 very different diagnoses. And I think this case kind of opened that totally up. And people are really kind of listening now to how serious mental health issues can be. So I think it's a really interesting case to start with. And I think tomorrow is going to definitely, Rich, you're right, bring some serious, questions as to where this, where the husband or ex-husband is on all of this at this point, because he's a little bit. It's confusing. Like, is he supporting her? I mean, she killed his kids, and what's happening now? Like, is he? Obviously, he's not okay with what happened, but it sounds like before they started to get into all of this that he supposedly like forgives her and feels bad for her. So it's really interesting. I can't wait to see what's going to happen tomorrow, because right now he's just a willing witness and he's answering the questions, right? Really calmly. So I'm interested to see where the, direct continues to go tomorrow and where the cross is going to go, how that's going to look.
I think towards the end of the day's testimony, you start to hear Shannon Buckingham, the ADA for the Commonwealth, kind of get into, when they started to discuss, when your wife first told you that she had thoughts of harming herself and possibly the children, like, what did you do? And she didn't ask that question once. She asked it at least 3 times. So you can kind of see, where it was going before the day ended. I suspect we'll get a lot more on that tomorrow, kind of what his role was.
And it's interesting.
Really Yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's interesting because, like, as in my perspective, just as a clinical therapist, when there is something like this at home going on, if we're involved thinking, asking the questions about, what did you know? Like, you had no idea that this was a possibility. he's kind of at risk for like, where was your complete just turning a blind eye to what's going on, danger your children were in, if they were. So, he's got to be answering truthfully, but at the same time, he also needs to be careful.
Yeah, so definitely looking forward to his testimony tomorrow. But I want to go back to the beginning of the opening statements because, as you mentioned before, um, how the defense is going to present this postpartum psychosis theory, uh, and the Commonwealth right away they try to jump and get out of in front of that. So the one of the first things that Attorney Buckingham stated was basically she's trying to depict how normal of a day
Yeah.
that fateful day was on January 24th, 2023. She started describing what went on in the morning when Lindsay took her oldest daughter to the doctor that morning, how she was sending pictures to her husband, them at the doctor's office, how when she got home from the doctor, she took her two oldest children outside to play in the snow while their 8-month-old Callan was sleeping. Again, sending photos to her husband who was in the basement of the home working, um, trying to kind of lay out all trying to really get ahead of the argument that she was on some sort of psychotic break, basically intimating that this is not the behavior of somebody who is in the midst of some sort of psychosis, going to the doctor, playing with the kids, sending photos to their husband, kind of just normal things you would do if you had three basically children that age. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that was actually very smart to kind of get ahead of it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but she came out. She's definitely, hearing where this case is going and it's really trying to get out in front of it. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, and I definitely picked up on that, with like, listening to try to see where are they going with, what are they setting up? Because we know that they do that in the opening statements. They're setting up that like, narrative that they want you to kind of carry with you as a juror throughout the case because, they're so insistent in the beginning, like the opening statements are not evidence, right? But they're kind of like your roadmap. I believe this judge even said directly when he was giving the jury, those like the beginning instructions, or he was just talking to them when he was basically just gave them their oath and everything. And it was interesting because I caught that too, because, when you think of a psychotic break, you don't think of that kind of typical behavior, like everything's okay. And the reality is when there is psychosis, it most often doesn't look like typical behavior. And specifically with postpartum psychosis, or and that it is it's on that bipolar spectrum. So you go from lows to highs. So there's this manic like break, right? There's like this, they call it like a manic switch where you can be operating pretty normally. And then there can be this manic switch that kind of flips. But typically when you're in like psychosis, you're sort of on like this trajectory downward, right? You're like, you have severe insomnia, which they brought up in the opening, right? That there was like this
Oh
not
yeah.
sleeping well, right? There was like this agitation, this rapid mood switch. It isn't, let's go play in the snow with the kids while I already put the other one down calmly for a nap. It doesn't typically look like that, which is why I think they're doing a good
And that's
job.
what I think the challenge of this case is going to be, because obviously in every case, the prosecution has to prove their case. In theory, the defense doesn't
Yeah,
really have to do much of anything. They don't have to put on a defense. I
right.
think the case is a little bit different because what you just said there, like most of the time when you're in a psychotic break, there are some patterns and signs, right? I don't know that. So the way I look at
Mhm.
psychosis is, I guess, the way you look at it in the movies, in the sense where you think the person is really just out of his or her mind, you
Right,
know, doing things that you and I would, or the general public would consider abnormal, right? Not playing in the backyard with children, not taking their kids to the doctor's office. So the defense, I think, has to really put on evidence here to explain that to people like me. You know that, but
right,
I work in your mental health therapy practice, and I don't know that.
right.
These jurors, I'm fairly certain,
Wouldn't.
are not going to have a clue. They probably share a lot of the same thoughts that I have. Where if the person's psychotic, like it's what you think of a psychotic person when you say the word. Like, that's what I would imagine they
Right,
think. So
right.
I
You
don't think
think
it's the type of case.
disorganized behavior, right. You're not
100%.
gonna think of that like methodical,
Right.
typical behavior.
Right. That's why I don't think it's the type of case where the defense can sit back and say the prosecution failed to meet a burden, so not guilty
Right.
by reason of insanity. I think it's one of the few cases where the defense is going to have to do work because
Yeah.
no, I think everybody goes into this, especially when, and we'll get into a little bit more of the behavior that ADA Buckingham, considers, at least in her definition, to be normal. Um,
Mhm.
that's going to be tough to overcome because of the sheer, just tragic nature of the case.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
graphic
Agreed.
nature of it. It's just that visceral reaction when you get from even hearing it. Um, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit more when I get into the defense's opening, because I think the one thing that he did very well, when he started, he basically started with the jurors' commitment to the oath and how important that is, because
Yeah.
they're going to hear things that on some level are going to make you dislike her or hate
Yeah.
her. And that's, if you're reminded though that you have to look past those feelings, if you do have them, and focus on the evidence and hold true to your oath, you can get to not guilty by reason of insanity. That's the only
Mhm.
way you could get there. And I thought it was smart that he kind of jumped ahead. He
Yeah.
got right into that. I think he kind of, you know, fell off the tracks a little bit after that, and we'll get into that later on. But
Yeah.
let's go back a little bit to the rest of the opening,
Yeah.
um, and briefly, because this is the part I just hate talking about. Kind of briefly go over what happened on that day
Yeah.
when Patrick was sent out to get, to go to CVS to get some Pedialyte and 3B
Right.
restaurant takeout. So what we do know, and obviously this is not in dispute, is that Patrick left the house around 5:15 p.m. Lindsay had called in takeout to a restaurant, 3B restaurant, um, and she had also asked Patrick to pick up a Miralax for the eldest daughter, on the advice of the doctor from earlier that
Mhm.
day. The odd part is, she went on allegedly Apple Maps, searched for how long the distance, from her house to the restaurant. Obviously, that's going to give you not only the miles, but how long that round trip would be. She also knew she asked Patrick to go to CVS, so she knew that that would take X amount of time longer than just the restaurant. And in those exact window, that window of roughly 20 to 25 minutes is when she, went down in the basement and did what she did to the three children. Um,
And then he called.
I'm
Right.
sorry, say it one more time.
And then he called. He called, and
Yeah,
that's
so
what's also really interesting.
she apparently, and ADA said this will come out in evidence. She apparently, after she did this to the children, went upstairs into the kitchen, grabbed a knife. During that time period, Patrick had called. She had missed that call. However, she returned it. She called him back after
Yeah.
grabbing a knife,
Do we
and they
know? I was
spoke
gonna
for
ask you,
14
yeah,
seconds.
that's after
So
grabbing the knife?
it was after. So they spoke for 14 seconds. We don't know, what was spoken about, but Patrick basically said that there was nothing unusual in that call, right? She puts the phone down, goes upstairs to her second bedroom, uh, up to the second floor to her master bedroom, opens the door, locks it, crushes pills, takes them in an attempt to kill herself, takes that kitchen knife, um, cuts her wrist and her neck, and then apparently opens the window and throws herself out in an attempt to, again, commit suicide.
Mhm.
So in that 24-minute window, those are the events that took place. But what I think the state really wants you to focus on is that 14-second call, right? How, like you were mentioning earlier, that sometimes when you're in the throes of psychosis, maybe you're not how I depicted in my own head. Maybe you do have those lucid intervals. Um, but Patrick wasn't alarmed at all by at least the context or content of that phone call. So,
Right, I think he
and that was
described it as normal.
right, and that was seconds to minutes after she did what she did to the children. So it's a lot to overcome. And if that in fact is
Yeah.
true, and I'm sure they'll bring in experts or, phone
Yeah.
records, people to
Sure.
testify to the
Because
fact of a 14-minute phone
and
call.
then
They'll expect that tomorrow.
yeah,
But
and
yeah,
it'll be a question of, what does it look like? And this is what's tricky about this whole psychosis discussion is that it isn't black and white. It isn't like when you're in psychosis, this is what you do. There are people who have been reported to be in psychosis and are disorganized. They are like what you would imagine in a movie, somebody who is being psychotic or is in psychosis, where, they look like they're crazed and you would be like, oh my gosh, and want to run away. But then there are people that report being in psychosis and being methodical and almost flat and just moving through one action to another. And they don't seem like that very scary psychosis. So, that 14-second phone call could have been like, is there anything else the kids need? Doesn't, one of them need a new toothbrush? And she's like, nope. Okay.
and
All
it,
right. Well, see you in
and
a
you're
little
right.
bit.
There was a lot of talk, obviously leading up from September 22 to January 23. A lot of talk about a flat affect,
Yeah.
lack of the ability to emote.
Right. Like what's
We
normal?
heard it
Who's
a lot.
describing normal?
Right,
Right.
we
What's
heard
her
it a lot.
normal?
Yeah, and that was kind of her baseline. She was getting worse according to Patrick, but the thing that, again, is gonna be challenging for the defense to overcome, in my opinion anyway, is that day, apparently, at least according to Patrick, it was one of her best days.
Yeah.
So, she wasn't flat that day, or
Right.
maybe she was just so flat so often that even a 5% improvement, even though you and I would have looked at her,
And
having
maybe
never met
lucky.
her, and be
Right.
like, "Wow,
Right.
she's, like,
Like
basically
he's using his
catatonic."
own, right, his
Right.
own,
He's using his own.
measure.
Right, which you and maybe we met her one time and we were like, "Wait, no, she's, like, almost catatonic and a zombie."
Right.
And he's like, "No, today's a good day. She's actually speaking for more than 5 minutes."
Right.
So, again, that's gonna get, I think, fleshed out a little bit more. I think it, probably should be tomorrow
Yeah.
and going
Well,
forward.
especially because that could be a question for, so wait, her behavior, her demeanor is different. So if it's different, then can we say that that's hypomanic? So there's manic and there's hypomanic. Um, and it's either one of those states that's really required for to go from that, like, low to high, to have that,
Yeah,
to be in that psychosis. And hypomanic, is different from manic. It looks different. Manic is that, again, that clear, like extraordinarily heightened state. There's really no question what manic is when you see it. But
yeah,
hypomanic is not as clear. It's not as extreme. So maybe him saying she has a good day was her becoming, was her hypomanic. So I really think, the facts of the case are terrible. It is not in dispute that she killed the children. It is not in dispute how she killed the children. There is no getting around that. Um, so I think we all want to hate her at, like, how could you do that? But
right.
I think, like you mentioned, what defense counsel did good was that he's making you, or at least he's setting up that you don't hate her. You have hate and anger and, like, what happened. And he's building all that up. And then there's going to be a transfer that he's
Right.
hoping you give that anger to,
Yeah,
not
hate the
her,
system. Yeah,
but
hate the medical
right.
system, hate the
Yeah.
overreach of the government,
The
kind of she's
government
a
that he's
victim. Yeah,
calling the state.
she's the
Right.
victim of big pharma and the medical
Right.
field. Um,
And the truth is, I mean, those a couple of things can be true at the same time, right? We can
and I was
actually
say that it doesn't
disagree.
have to be
Right.
mutually exclusive. Yeah, I think you can have 2
Right.
things be true at the same time, certainly.
Right.
But you know,
Absolutely.
he has his work cut out for him because, okay, you could be hypomanic, but when do you come out of that? Because when
Right.
Patrick returned home around 6:11 and he's, tending to his wife on the floor and he goes to Lindsay, "Hey, where are the kids?" She responds, "They're in the basement." So,
Right.
again, this is going back to maybe my ignorance, but if you're in the middle of a psychotic, fit,
Yeah.
you just immediately respond. You know exactly what's going on. You have that recall. I don't know.
Yeah.
You tell me, is that something where
Yeah.
it's just like it's there? Like you don't
No, and
forget
that's
anything,
the
like you're
tricky
still in it?
thing, right? So, and it really depends on like what her, and this is what I think the experts are going to come on and talk about is that when, because you can have the presentation of flat and methodical and be in psychosis, but then also have the presentation of um, crazed and disorganized and manic, right? In the presentation, it depends. It's like, when you have low blood pressure and it's not an issue because you always have low blood pressure. But like if you are
Right.
normal blood pressure and then one day have low, that's an outlier, right? So, what were her presentations of when she was depressed or not depressed? Like, what was her way? I think is going to be really important to come out to see then what is normal for her and what's not normal for
So,
her.
and I think you're right. And obviously, this is just opening statement. It's not evidence. It's just a kind of a roadmap of where it's going. But let's get into a little bit of what at least the ADA thinks
Yeah.
is like what her normal, what was her baseline
Right,
at least
right. And
from,
also, Rich, I want to say even before you go there is like, what are we talking about here? Like, what does, because you said before this, not guilty by reason of insanity. And it's a little different in Massachusetts, right? They don't use that insanity term. They
right,
use instead not criminally responsible. So
right,
what's interesting, like the uphill battle here is that, you know, the with this defense, that defense attorney's got to show that she really lacked the capacity to be able to both appreciate the wrongful nature of her conduct and that she couldn't conform that to law, like she couldn't understand what she was doing, which would make her not criminally responsible, right? So she didn't have that capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness and of her conduct or conform it to the law. And
right.
that
But
I do
he,
think is
he
going
has
to be
to do
really
it, and
hard.
also he has to do that and compete with the fact that there was some intentionality, there was
Right,
some precision in her
right,
movements and timing,
right.
right? There
But he
were
doesn't have to prove insanity. That's what's so
right,
interesting, right?
right,
And that's where I think that the mental health stuff's going to be really muddy. I think that's why he's throwing out there like to hate the big pharma. It was the psychiatrist. It was the lack of help that she was getting as she was so seeking this all out. And I think we need to be careful because, just really like stepping back and looking at all of this um, and realize that while, yeah, her way sounds like on paper, she was really seeking help and wasn't really getting what she needed along the way. Or was she setting up a great, defense ahead of time? Was
yeah,
she like,
yeah.
this is what I needed to look like to be insane in this area? I know this is what
So
I
the
I know, so I'm
Commonwealth,
not criminally responsible.
yeah, the Commonwealth came out and said it that she's manipulative, she's controlling,
Right.
and
Right.
and the and they
I thought that was
used
interesting in
what
opening statements, right?
right,
To
and
throw
I
that out
actually
there, like,
found it
that's a reason.
fascinating that they didn't run away from the number of medications prescribed,
Hmm.
right? They didn't run away from the number of doctors, that were involved in her care. Okay. They just took a completely different track. They basically said that she was the one seeking out these medications. She was not honest with her husband about the medications that she was taking or when she
Right.
started taking them, right?
Right.
We had the story in September of 2022 at the wedding in New Hampshire, right? When she went to Patrick and said, "I'm thinking about taking Zoloft. What do you think?" And they speak about it. Unbeknownst to him, he later finds out that she had already sought out a psychiatrist, Jennifer Tufts, who just had a miserable day on day one, who
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
basically, if you listen to the defense, is the boogeyman.
Yeah.
So, you know, she had already sought the care of Jennifer Tuss and had already had the prescription, did not take the medication yet, but had the prescription of Zoloft at that September wedding in New Hampshire.
Right.
So
So she
the
was already
state,
not really being totally forthright.
exactly. And I think the state, and state kind of mentioned that several times with you know, when she said that she couldn't speak to a doctor when she was at the McLean Rehab Center. And, and it kind of slowly comes out during Patrick's testimony that, she said she wants to leave a day early and, she doesn't want to join the group that day. Even though all these things were offered to her, it
Yeah.
turns out at least, maybe we'll get more clarity on it. At least now she was kind of saying no to some of these things. So it's, that's kind of the challenge here. That's going to be what that defense has to overcome. But it is going to be one of the few cases, I think, in my opinion, where the defense actually they're going to have to really work. They're going to have
Yeah.
to really work. They're going to have
Yeah.
to put on some sort of defense that at least explains it to people like me. And
Right. Sure.
obviously, I've been a lawyer for a long time, and this is so far out of the realm when you're dealing
Yeah.
with this level of kind of insanity and psychosis, and it looks so different than what I expect, I guess. So I think it needs to really
Absolutely.
be, yeah, nailed
And
down.
I think the other thing, you bring up a good point of like, what you would expect out of this, and what you know and don't know. And when you're like right in front of this, front and center, you kind of forget what people know and don't know. Like there's so many things I have in my mind that I want to say out loud that that are things I know is not common knowledge on some of these things, but there's just so much. Like, for example, they talk about this postpartum depression and then this postpartum psychosis. One doesn't lead to another. That's not how it works. It's not like postpartum depression becomes postpartum psychosis. They're two completely distinct diagnoses. And then, even more interestingly, postpartum psychosis is like not even its own standalone diagnosis. It's really now under like a bipolar diagnosis with like a peripartum onset with like hallucinations, auditory or visual. So it's not even like we're using language that's like good for everybody to understand, but without giving them all of the real important understanding of like what this really looks like. And I think that can confuse people because I think a lot of people can identify with postpartum depression and can identify with being really down. And then I think, and I'm not sure who this serves to have this confusion because I think a lot of people go through postpartum depression and are like, I would never kill my kids. But I understand what that is to be depressed. So there's hurdles everywhere with this. And I think it's going to be hard because I don't think it's super clear for even the people, in it every day. Because like I said before, there's no clear black and white to how this works. Like, for example, even with this postpartum psychosis, which I'll continue on that framing because it's a lot easier than saying all the long words of, bipolar with mania and peripartum onset with, yeah. But what's interesting is, there's like a lot of pieces. There's a lot of moving parts to this. And I just think it's going to be very difficult to make it clear with, postpartum psychosis is not even typically diagnosed after like a month after a baby's born. So the like likelihood of having a postpartum psychosis is really, really low. And it's also usually only diagnosed like within the first 2 to 4 weeks after the child is born for the mother to be at risk for it.
And I
So
think we're
8 months
talking about
later,
4 months after Callan was born, right? Because she started to seek treatment 4 months prior to
right.
that, the
That's
phase.
assuming she was having any kind of psychosis at that time. The only documented psychosis that they're talking about is the day she killed the kids.
Yeah, because
So,
she had postpartum depression starting after the second child. So it wasn't like it was it
but
wasn't
remember,
the
that's
third birth
a
that did
separate
it. Right,
diagnosis. Right.
right.
So
It
she
seemed like
maybe did.
right, like this
Yeah.
high anxiety, this postpartum sort of symptoms really came about, at least according to Patrick. Every time she was due to return to work after
Right.
maternity leave, the
Yeah.
anxiety spiked, right? The pressure became too much for her. And she, finally after the birth of the second child, Dawson, she sought, medical care for, postpartum.
Right.
So you're right. This is not something that would kind of just came out of nowhere, but, you know, What I need to know more of is, can you go in and out of postpartum psychosis within that same day? How often can you go in and out? How often can you have lucid intervals? Because there is, at least in my opinion, a lot of quote unquote normal behavior that day. Um,
Right.
there's a lot of intentional behavior that day.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to sit here and say, like, clearly the months prior, the 4 months prior, she was, I don't think there's any dispute that she had mental health issues and she was kind of spiraling. But, and I
Right.
think the Commonwealth, she said in her opening, attorney Buckingham, what she said, you know, she told the jury that people with mental health illnesses commit crimes every single day and they're held legally responsible. So it's
Right.
really not a mental health issue. This is whether or not, she was psychotic um, during those moments. And, it's going to be a challenge,
Yeah.
going forward for the defense, certainly.
Yeah. No, and I mean, like, even to like just briefly touch on that, and there's still everything is very like fact specific. That's why nothing's like black and white. Like the DSM is filled with like specific criteria. You have to be presenting this for at least 2 weeks. And, but so there are some things in mental health that are very black and white like that. But a lot of this stuff, it gets a little bit more like it depends. And the truth is, like, a person can kind of go in and out of psychosis, so to speak. Um, but it's more of that they're not going in and out of psychosis. They're going in and out of like what looks like, like obvious psychosis, which is why that call is an interesting one. Um, you know, but the truth is, specifically with postpartum psychosis, you could have that confusing, like, are you still in psychosis or are you not? So there is that a little bit of that like fluctuation, and it can appear like that. It doesn't mean you're
Right.
in and out. It just
Right.
is giving off that appearance. And that's why I'm saying I think it's going to be really important for us to see what is her typical affect. If we're
At
talking
least,
about somebody who's
yeah,
like,
but
go
I
ahead. Yeah.
think it would go a long way if which I think we'll find out tomorrow. What were those 14 seconds about? Because if
Yeah.
she goes to Patrick, where are you? Are you almost home? To me, she returns that call to figure out how long she has to complete the task, right? If she,
Right.
if he, she returns the call and Patrick goes, is whatever, is this
Right.
Pediac? Is this the right one? And she goes, yeah, it's the right one. You're almost home. How far away?
Yeah.
Then it's like,
It makes
okay,
it confusing, yeah.
yeah,
But being organized doesn't necessarily mean they have an intact reality. And that's something that you really do need to kind of cling to. And I think that's what the defense is going to cling to,
yeah,
because we can appear as we're behaving organized. We're doing things what appears to be methodically, but that doesn't mean my reality is intact. So I agree. It's going to be an interesting to find out what that phone call was, considering how short it was. I'm sure there wasn't a lot of substantive conversation going on,
right,
but even still, um, I think if it was a 3-minute phone call, it'd be more problematic for the defense to overcome that level of not being confused about, the demeanor of the person at that point in that amount of time. Um, 14 seconds, I think it was. I think he can miss. I think that can be where, a few words are exchanged, especially if it comes out that she's not, a chatty Cathy. I mean, there's like a lot that we need to learn really
right.
also about her.
Did she hear the phone ring and miss it because she couldn't get to it in time, or did she actually just go check her phone? Did she
That's a
never
great
hear it
question.
ring? Right? It's almost like that's what I would like
That's a
to know.
great
I don't know if
question.
we're gonna get the answer,
Yeah.
right? We're obviously probably not gonna
I
get
hope we
the
do.
answer.
Somebody
I
should
don't know
ask
how
that
you could.
question.
I don't think she's gonna testify.
No,
That's really the
no.
only way we're gonna find out. But,
Yeah.
if she didn't hear the phone ring and she simply went to check her phone, like, whew,
Yeah.
it's that's a
That's
lot,
chilling. That's
you know?
well, that's the
Yeah,
whole thing is that, whether I mean, let's be real, whether this was the work of an evil person or the work of someone in psychosis, this is chilling. That's why this is such a, this is why the defense counsel said to the jury, God bless you.
yeah.
This is a tough one.
You
And
know
that's
what? It's
kind of why,
actually
yeah.
sorry, go no, go ahead. No, I
No,
was saying it's a good
yeah.
kinda good segue into, um, uh, defense counsel Kevin Reddington, his opening. Um,
Mhm.
Obviously he had a it's like pushing a rock uphill with the case, and you could tell he's a very experienced attorney, and he's wearing it on his face. Like, he's
Oh
feeling it.
yeah.
I don't think it's an act by him. Um, he's obviously an incredible attorney. He's been doing it a long time, but this is gonna be tough.
Yeah.
That's why, like I mentioned earlier, I think he started out with, reminding the jurors of their oath, which is probably the only thing he could do. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
you can't argue the facts, right? I mean, they're not on his side. Um,
Right.
but then I think my only complaint with his opening was it got very close to gaslighting. I think it felt to me,
Yeah.
where it was almost like he was blaming everybody else, almost as if
He was
somebody else.
blaming the
So
state for
right,
bringing the
like
yeah,
right,
for
he
like
was going a
the
little bit, I think,
occurrences,
too far, blaming the psychiatrist and blaming the state,
for
and
putting her through this.
right, for putting her
Like,
through this,
she
which
killed
I
the
thought
kid.
was like right. So, you can blame the state for the way they're going about, I don't know, investigating the case. Maybe, like, he didn't like the fact that she was handcuffed to the bed. She's paralyzed. Where's she gonna go? Right?
Right.
You can have your beef with that, and I'll roll with you. That's fine. But
Right.
to kind of blame the state for bringing the case, to blame the psychiatrist when
Right.
not even 15 minutes after that, we learned that out of all those medications, even though they were kind of great in the number of prescriptions, the amount of pills she took were relatively low.
Well,
Right.
that's the thing is they're just giving, and a lot of people do it. I'm so glad you brought that up because that's a huge piece here is, the laundry list of medications doesn't mean that she's taking them all at the same time. And then they're all like, you don't give an SSRI to a bipolar. Like, yeah, no, that's not the typical practice. And I am not a prescriber. So this is not my area of expertise. But obviously I have some, psychopharmacology. That's a long word to say.
Oh God.
Psychopharmacology knowledge.
There's so many
So
words I don't even try to say. It's not
I
even
know.
worth it. Yeah.
But I have the knowledge of them, of course, because it's part of my competency is understanding the effects and how what they treat. And the reality is like it isn't typically prescribed, but if it were, it's prescribed with another mood stabilizer. So it isn't something that's like never a part of, but it's just not typical. But it's like the theatrics of confusing so that when his expert comes on and says that's never done, and then their expert comes on and will likely be like it isn't typically done, but it can be if it's paired with a lithium or
Right.
another mood stabilizer. Like, that's the one thing we don't need in this case is that
We also
kind of
don't know
confusing
exactly.
theatrics.
You need to see, or at least you have to have the testimony and see the documents when she was diagnosed with bipolar, because we don't know.
After the
We
deaths.
yes, but we gleaned from the prosecution that she could be manipulative, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, when she first met with Jennifer Tufts, what exactly did she present? How much of the truth about her condition did she present? We'll learn this, I'm sure, as the case goes on. But to come out and flat out say this case shouldn't have been here. You can never prescribe an SSRI to somebody with Zoloft. Kind of
She probably wasn't clearly bipolar, and
right.
she was probably really kind of leaning more towards postpartum depression in what she was saying was going on with her.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I also
Agreed.
thought it was fascinating. He spent a lot of time complaining about the logistics of the case, like the inconvenience of having to do a house view, right?
Yeah.
The
We're
guard
gonna
to have
take
to
you
guard the
over there.
door of the hospital, like
The pictures aren't enough. Like,
right.
no, this is kind of
Look,
typical
we
for a
know
court
why
case.
he's doing it. Every time he's doing that, it takes attention away from the fact that
Yeah.
there is a woman 20 feet behind him who killed her
It's
three
looking
kids.
really bad. Right.
Right. So we understand why he has to do it. I'm
Yeah.
not,
Well, that's
saying
the
he's
thing.
doing anything wrong,
He's
but
making you
you
hate something, right? He
exactly.
just doesn't want it to be his client.
Yes, you gotta be careful you don't come close to gaslighting the jury where they're sitting there going, "Wait a minute.
Feeling like you're making me feel stupid. Right.
At the end of the day, she did it." Now, whether or not she knew what she was doing, I'm going to hear you out on that, but don't
Right.
sit here and blame everybody else in the United States, basically, when at least admit that, she did it. There are reasons why
Right.
she did it. Don't basically say, like, this case is such an injustice because of the logistics are a nightmare. Like
Right.
that's not going to
Right.
go very
Ab
far.
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
need to
Okay.
focus on if he's gonna say that she's not criminally responsible because she couldn't, she couldn't appreciate the nature of what she was doing in the moment while she was under psychosis, then he needs to kinda stick to how her behavior was, bizarre for her, where there was these rapid changes. She did have this, cognitive dysfunction. She was experiencing these hallucinations, and they brought up that the male's voice that she heard that day, but never before and never again,
And
which
that's
is
another
also
thing.
why
She's never
yeah,
heard it. Yeah, that's
never heard it before. So that's where I'm I think they're kind of going towards like this was the psychotic break. There was this postpartum psychosis before, which is interesting because then, if there wasn't this bipolar presentation before, then what she was being prescribed wasn't so wrong. But if it still were the wrong thing, that's what then could give rise to a manic episode and could
well,
create this psychosis.
right, but you mentioned something before that was interesting because I think this is important. You can't focus on, I think, the number of prescriptions because a lot of times
Yeah.
the prescriber will adapt and adjust the medication depending on how you respond to it, what you
Right.
report. Like you get put on a medication, you check in, right? You say, "I'm feeling this, that, or the other thing," and the doctor or prescriber will be like, "Okay,
Adjust
let's hold
accordingly.
the course, let's adjust, let's get you off that medication entirely." And these things also have a lead
Or
up. It's not
layer
like
in
you take
something else that
right,
offsets that.
but you don't just take a Zoloft and it's like, "All right, I'm at 100% full board. The Zoloft is working." Like
Right.
you have to lead up.
You
These
tweak, right.
medications have to build up in your system, right? So, can 7 Zolofts do this? Even if Dr. Tufts made a mistake and prescribed Zoloft to somebody who's bipolar, and let's presume I don't even have a clue that that's complete completely incorrect and malpractice. Can 7 Zoloft pills cause you to have a psychotic break
Right.
weeks later? I don't know. Maybe we'll hear that it could, but
Right.
that's what he's up against because she did not take a great number of pills. She was prescribed a great number of prescriptions, but she did not take a large quantity of pills whatsoever.
Right. Right.
And even, when we get into, Patrick's testimony, yeah, he conceded that on the stand, that
And she wasn't
when they went
taking,
over
right.
each pill bottle, we have the counts, the 7 Zolofts, it
Right.
was 2 pills out of 30 of, so they listed, and it was just like, all right, she didn't take very many, certainly not enough, I think, at least in my, you know, lack of knowledge, enough to build up in your system to have any real effect.
Right. Right.
I don't think she took it long enough or took enough of it. She didn't even get through one course of a 30-day supply on any one of these medications. And she was never on really more than 2 at any one time.
And
So
I
even
feel
though there
like,
might have been 15 of them, she was
yeah,
only taking 2, which shows you that the doctors were trying to adapt to what
right.
she was reporting.
What she needed, what she was reporting. Exactly.
Right.
So she can't say, I feel sad all the time. And then they're like, I think there's more you're not telling me. I think this is bipolar. We have to
Right.
go on what she's reporting. So if she's
Right.
saying, I have this extreme mood instability, I'm unable to sleep, I'm hearing voices, I have command hallucinations, and then they're like, let's give you some stuff for postpartum depression. Then that, yeah, is like, wait, who are you listening to? You're not hearing me.
Yeah.
But the fact that there are these changes in the dosages and the fact that there's changes in the medicines show that it's like, okay, well, wait, maybe this isn't working. Let's figure this. And this is where, in the medicine world, we don't make things fit. They're trained to not make things fit. You're trained to not be like, oh, well, that sounds like ADHD. Do you also do this, this, and this? That's what this is. That's not what we do. We rule out. So, because we can make anything fit. That's why you're not supposed to go on WebMD and Google. You'll have like 90 different diagnoses
Oh
by
yeah.
the end of that web search. So
Yep.
that's why you're not supposed to do that stuff. But there's also, something just with my like, where my legal mind and my psychology mind mix that was interesting to me was his theatrics, are interesting to me because, if you remember when we were coming up through law school or even just like new young lawyers, when they would say, listen, if the facts are on your side, argue the facts. And if the law is on your side, argue the law. And if neither are on your side, just argue. I feel like he's a little bit in the just argue. He's throwing out
At least
numbers
in the
to the
opening,
jury.
it was almost like table banging. Yeah. It's like the
Yeah,
loudest
right.
voice in the
When you're
room.
doing this,
Yeah.
that goes with
Right.
that same statement. But the
Yeah.
truth is, like, he was saying things like 300 milligrams of Seroquel. Like
Right.
the people know what 300 milligrams
He
is.
he
Like,
was also I found it
you
fascinating.
know,
He was using a lot of first names to the jury. He had mentioned something
yeah,
like,
like
"Oh,
we
we
know
keep
these
hearing about
people.
how this house is a mansion." Like, the jury, at least they're supposed to not know anything about the case. So, you're talking about
And
things that they don't even know what's going on yet, and
no.
you're just, like, speaking like it's
And
day
he's like,
15 of the trial.
Bob's a great guy. It's like,
Right. Yeah.
who's Bob?
They don't know what's
And
going
then,
on. Yeah.
yeah. And then like little things that also, like it was just very interesting the way that he was going about a lot of that stuff. And to one of the things that you also really lose jurors on is when he makes some out of touch statements. And he said how these people don't live in this mansion. They're just doing the best they can.
Right.
And then here comes ex-husband on the stand and talks about how he's been squirreling away money so that if she didn't want to work, she didn't have to
Right.
work.
Yeah, which
That
most families can never put a
most
maternity
families have
fund
to have
away.
both parents working.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I
when
mean,
you act like they're just getting by, but then suddenly he's been making it so that she
and
could not work,
yes,
is a
and
little bit of an out of touch statement that loses some people.
right. No, it certainly is, especially I hate to say it, especially in today's economy, that hits a little bit harder.
Sure.
Like,
That
people
hits.
barely have enough money to get by, and you're talking about being
Yeah.
fortunate enough to have a maternity fund where, you know, they had the nannies,
Right.
they had
Right.
the ability
That's
to
right.
put
They didn't
away.
even right. They had a
It's
nanny. They had the
yeah,
kids in daycare. All these things are
right,
cost. All
right.
of this is something that's, not everybody can do. So to be
And they
like,
weren't doing
they're just
this
like
in some,
you.
this is in Massachusetts. We live in Connecticut. It's very
Right.
expensive in the Northeast. There's nothing cheap.
Right.
So
So to
you
say
can
those
imagine.
things.
Right, right. It's
Agreed. Agreed. And I do think that that's, you're setting up this like to hate someone. And then the prosecution is setting up this manipulative picture of the defendant. And then, you're already sitting next to someone for a little bit long that, you could also not be looking so good next to them after a while. So if you
right.
start to then also share some of the characteristics, like that feels manipulative, that feels disingenuous, that you just
Yep.
told me something that in the first 30 minutes of the trial, I learned is not totally true. That's
That's
not
what
a great look.
that's what got me. Like, if you're gonna sit there and blame the healthcare system, which we all have our gripes with, let's be honest. But
Sure.
if you're gonna sit there and say that this is the evil Dr. Tufts, this is a typical over prescription, not spending enough time with your patients, just like he was basically accusing her of being a little bit of a pill factory. It's like, all right, what do you
Yeah.
have? Here's your pills. And then
Meanwhile,
within, like you said, within 30 minutes, we learned that she barely took any of this stuff. I
yeah.
mean, you got to get me at least past 30 minutes, like before.
And and also clearly was having a conversation with her patient about, let's say, Zoloft with, where it wasn't like you're taking this. There was clearly some kind of like, this is an option, because then she brought that up to her husband at the time that I'm thinking about doing this, even though she already had the pills. She
Right,
still had clearly the awareness that this isn't like you show up there and then you have to take it.
right.
Um, she's also in the field of medicine. Like nobody's bringing that up yet. Like she wasn't somebody. It's like you can't kind of claim you didn't know some like the bar is higher for people who are like supposed to know the law, let's say. So you can't be like, oh, I had no idea. When like, well, you're a lawyer,
Right.
you kind of should know. So there's not that she should be knowing about prescriptions and what she should take and not should take, but there should definitely be a little bit more of a communication and access to
She has
people.
she has a lot more resources than a normal
Right.
person would. I
Right.
mean,
She goes to
she's
work and her
surrounded.
resources are
Right,
theoretically there.
and
Yeah.
he's in, and the defense counsel's right, one of the best hospitals,
She's a
that's
mass
for
general. Right.
yeah, I mean,
So
so
that was interesting to me. But I definitely I think there's a lot that's going to come out here that's going to look like, if he came out with a lot of good facts, good things that were like rebutting, some of what the prosecution was saying, I'd feel like, you know what, he's confident in that they really just didn't do what they were supposed to do. I mean, honestly, postpartum psychosis affects like I think it's like 1%. Like it's a ridiculously low number. I'll look that
right.
up and share that next time. But I know it's extraordinarily low. And then to have postpartum psychosis and then infanticide on top of it is even extraordinarily lower still. So to be like they completely didn't do their jobs when we're talking about a diagnosis that's extraordinarily rare. And she clearly wasn't totally appropriately saying her symptoms because none of the people she reached out to, and they were multiple different places, could
Yeah.
really put a finger on what was going on. So she
Yeah, she wound up
wasn't
leaving Dr. Tufts to go into a different doctor, and
right,
mother-in-law,
right.
recommended her to a
And
different,
she was at a place that was like an inpatient for a few days, wasn't she? And that there's
yeah.
teams of prescribers. So
There's also
there's gotta be this
individual and group care. Yeah. Yeah, there's
right,
I guess
right,
I just we'll see where it goes. Obviously, he doesn't have an obligation to tell you everything in opening. He doesn't have to tell you anything in opening, but
right.
I hope he provides more than, SSRI shouldn't be prescribed to somebody with bipolar.
Yeah,
I hope he has more than he was just giving too many prescriptions because, you know, that took a hit. Even the limited testimony and, presentation of evidence that we have so far, that
yeah,
argument already took a significant hit with just the
yeah,
fact that he didn't really take, a large number of pills. It wasn't in
yeah,
her system for very long. So, you know, I think it's best to kind of hold off and save Patrick's testimony for when he completes it, for when he
yeah.
finishes the direct
It's a good
and
idea, yeah.
maybe even his cross. So we'll get into that, on episode
Yeah.
2.
And we touched
Um,
on it too with some of the things that
yeah,
he said when we talked about like what came out. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. The one thing I do want to clarify that wanted to clarify before is this whole diagnosis when I brought up that it's not its own standalone diagnosis and that it's under the bipolar spectrum. It is and it isn't. In the DSM-5, the most recent publication, it is diagnosable under like a bunch of different diagnoses because it has that that pre,
yeah,
um, and then post diagnosis. So it can be under quite a few diagnoses. It's just more and more and more being looked at as consistent with bipolar. And then there was this whole 2025 research paper that came out that it was like a whole like expert consensus they called it that really does kind of tie it to the bipolar spectrum. So it's just a little nuance that I just want you guys as our listeners that are coming here for us as the experts here on this to be able to kind of catch that nuance is that while it's not its own standalone, like you can't go to the DSM and turn to postpartum psychosis like you can for generalized anxiety disorder. But what you would do is you'd look under the different diagnoses, the different mood disorders, and have what would be a peripartum or postpartum onset, and with or without hallucinations or delusions. And but now the consensus is moving towards that it really fits well under that bipolar because of the manic presentation and because of the cycling between that manic and depressive episodes that by the way are not like very far apart. They really cycle quite quickly, which is what gives that psychotic kind of, feature, but could also be hidden. That's the part that I think the defense is going to be arguing because there was no clear, disorganization since the prosecution's already kind of presented that. So he's going to try to, and it's not that that's fake. That could be, but
And
we
you
need to
saw
see
the
that.
Commonwealth getting ahead of it a little bit with the garage sale,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
organized that was. They kept bringing it up, and I'll give, defense counsel, he basically said that when you see photos of the house, it's not the controlled, meticulous OCD style that the state was kind of
Yeah.
intimating. There was stuff everywhere. It was all about the kids. It
Yeah.
wasn't, there were toys everywhere. Everything was based around her love for the kids. It wasn't that she needed to have this controlling, perfect, clean house, or like she wasn't overly controlling and
Right.
organized. It was a little bit disorganized, but in a loving sense, you
Right.
know? So yeah, you're right. He's going to have to thread that needle. I certainly just want to learn more, and I'm going to learn a lot more from you going
Yeah.
forward, but I need
Yeah.
to know more from, his experts.
Yeah. And I
He
wonder
really has, yeah.
too, sorry, Rich. Yeah. And
No, yeah.
I wonder too, like, they bring up the controlling, they bring up that stuff. And, there is that postpartum OCD. Like, I wonder if they're trying to paint a picture of, like, listen, there was some definite postpartum mood stuff going on. But it wasn't psychosis, and that is the distinction here.
And
Because you need to be in
where
psychosis to be held not criminally responsible, or at least
that's
to
where,
argue you're not
yep,
criminally responsible.
and that's where it's gonna be at. It's gonna be that difference, like, postpartum, I don't even that's not in dispute. Um,
Right, right,
did it rise to the level of PPP? That's a
right.
that's a that's a whole different animal, and, it's not like he has 5 hours worth of activity to kinda pick apart and say, "See, this is
Yeah,
why she was psychotic." It's basically 24 minutes.
right.
That's what we're dealing with. It was a 24-minute psychotic episode,
Yeah,
and then it was gone, and that
right.
voice
And
never came back.
was it those 24 minutes?
Yeah.
Because she said, "How far away is this? Can you go get blah, blah, blah food?"
Mhm.
So when was it? And then how come? Were there really no changes in behavior? So then was the psychosis going on for 24 hours? So
Yeah.
I think there's just so many questions
It's so
that
relative. It's
I don't think they're
relative,
going to get
yeah.
all answered. I
No,
don't.
it's also relative to her normal not normal, her baseline for that week, that month, those preceding 4 months.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about before, yeah, it was a good day. But what does a good day mean in Patrick Clancy? It's probably a lot different than a good day,
Right.
for you
Right.
and I with our kids. So,
But how low
you know,
is the bar? Because she's been
exactly.
struggling mentally for a while,
Right,
It's like,
right.
so that was her good day. Her good day might have been like, 'cause she got out of bed, she maybe goes to work and comes home and gets, so we got to see, like, what is this good day?
No, and that's a good
Um,
point because they couldn't celebrate their anniversary in November because they had to cancel their plans because she couldn't do it. She wasn't up to
right.
it.
Right.
On
So, and what
Thanksgiving,
does not up to it look like? Like, my
yeah,
not up to it is like, I am asleep by like 11 o'clock. My normal is like, we're watching shows and hanging out till, 1 o'clock in the morning. So
yeah,
what's
true
their
crime stuff.
not up to it?
Yeah. No, right. No, and even, like, they kinda ended the day with Thanksgiving. They did 2 different Thanksgivings. They did, each side, had a Thanksgiving, one at his sister's house. Um, so, the ADA spoke to, Patrick and, basically asked the question, "How was she during Thanksgiving?" And he said, "Not great." She
Yeah.
wasn't speaking much. She was very down. Um, yeah, just kind of,
Yeah.
was there, but
Yeah.
didn't really say much. So,
Right. But
I don't know.
yeah, but that's also like, again, put my lawyer hat on for a second. Like, and again, it's always easier to play Monday morning quarterback, but I don't know if I mean, I certainly wouldn't with my, clinician hat on, but like, I don't know if I would take the approach of, the psychiatrists and therapists and all of them were, terrible at their job because, like I said before, we're talking about a extraordinarily rare diagnosis, an even more extraordinarily rare situation that's coming out of the diagnosis, like infanticide, right? And then on top of it, um, a presentation of symptoms that are not the typical presentation of what psychosis looks like. I mean, she's driving in a lane of like 0.01% across
And
the board. And then to chastise the people for not catching it.
and what do
So,
we know? What do we know about her? What did you show me last
right.
night
It's just
about
a
her?
bad look, right? That she
She
does have some manipulation in there
no,
and
no,
does,
not even about Jennifer Tufts.
oh,
She, when you showed me her profile, I
yeah,
mean, at least to
this
me,
is her
she looked like a
background.
fairly young, right?
She's young.
So
This is her background.
So
This
that's
is,
why I think he's gonna harp on this because he's
yeah,
going to say that a relatively inexperienced, at least I think so, an inexperienced doctor failed to catch
yep,
this rare condition. If she
right,
had gone to an experienced practitioner, they would have caught this. They would have
right.
definitely not prescribed the
And I
SSRI.
hope that's not what he alludes to, because that's so unfair and probably not true. But also, I just think it's a bad look for him because he's going to play that. He's got to ride that train all through the inpatient place. He's got to ride that train all the way to everywhere she's been and sought help.
And
So it's
not all
almost
those
like at what
doctors,
point,
right? Yeah.
right? And at what point is the problem the way she's describing her symptoms? So I feel like the approach should have been like, the system failed her, but not necessarily because the people behind it are bad. Like, you don't get mad at the soldiers. You get, you can be against
The cause.
the cause, but
Yeah.
not the people who think they're doing the right thing and feel like they're doing the
Yeah.
right thing. And that's the same
You
thing
may
with these docs.
disagree about the policy, but you support the people
Right.
who
That's
are
what I meant to say. Thank you. Yeah. Um, Absolutely. Like you can't take that kind of extreme stance with these facts if they
yeah,
are the facts. But you
right.
just can't. If those are the facts you're putting out there, and that's why I felt that table slamming. I felt the just argue as I watched him, and I was like, that to
I
me is like when you watch a movie where there's like an inappropriate scene right away, and you're like, this is not going to be that great of a
right.
movie because they got to hook you, and it's not going to be on the acting or the substance.
I
That's what
guess,
I
yeah.
felt.
I was alarmed by how early it came because
Yeah,
I expected the table banging, but I thought he would end with it. If you start
yeah,
with it, like, you're supposed to start with like it. I would start with my strongest foot forward, and he
yes,
started with
that's
that.
it.
So I was sitting there going, "Oh man, if
Yeah.
we're gonna sit here and go, this is a failure of the system argument, I don't know if that's gonna be enough." I mean,
And if it is
this
still like, if he's right, it's a failure of the system. He's going about it the wrong way, that we're going to miss that because we're just going to get more turned off by the presentation than the facts that maybe do support a broken system situation. But I think he's going to lose it. He's going to lose it because it's just not clear. You can't be like, had you not see it when you're telling me to look at, an optical illusion. Like,
Yep.
it's hard to see, man. That's why I'm not seeing it. So I
Yeah.
don't think it was a good look. I don't think it was a good play from a legal perspective. If I were to put my old litigator hat on, I don't think that was the right way to go. And from the clinical lens, there's a lot here. Nothing is that black and white. So
Right. But I
when he
mean, the
makes,
good thing is it's not evidence yet. So I mean,
yeah,
we have plenty of time for it. We'll find out, soon enough. But yeah, we'll definitely pick it up tomorrow with Patrick's testimony. Um,
yes,
I don't know how long he's going to be on the stand. I don't know how long the rest of the direct's going to be. I don't know to what extent, he's going to be crossed. Um,
right,
but I do think the prosecution's doing a good job of really focusing the attention of his testimony on Lindsay and not really going into the graphic and horrific nature of discovering the children. Because
yeah,
why that
yeah,
plays to emotion, it doesn't get you like right now. You need him to kind of walk you through her state of mind for 4 months, the amount of medication she was in fact taking,
right,
what
yeah,
you were doing to kind of help her out. And I think that's what yesterday was all about.
yeah,
So let's see, hopefully that's true going forward. But we'll
yeah.
definitely pick it up on episode 2. Yeah, and we'll break down Patrick's testimony.
Yeah,
So
and
until
we can
next
go
time.
into a little more,
Oh,
yeah,
oh,
sorry, I was gonna say we
you
can go
want
into a
to say?
little more.
Go
No, from that clinical piece, we can go into a little more of like what that lack of insight, that's really a required piece to,
ahead.
diagnosing the postpartum psychosis, what that really looks like. 'Cause I think this case is going to turn on a lot of that too, is the
That's what I
ability to
want to know.
realize, like, yeah, because like if you're going down that psychosis route, you have this poor insight to the point where it isn't a slow progression. And you also, interestingly, don't really seek help when you're in psychosis because you just have a complete disconnect from reality. When you're in depression,
Yeah.
postpartum depression, you're connected to reality. So you know something is wrong. But once you're in psychosis, you don't. So there is that lack of
And
insight there.
and that's what I think, he's gotta treat somebody like me and the jurors as a blank slate because they always tell you and both and and, um, and the defense counsel did mention, like, bring your common sense with you
Yeah.
when you can't in this case really because everybody knows about postpartum depression. I've never heard of PPP before,
No,
right?
because
So
it's
I don't
extraordinarily rare.
I doubt anybody in that jury box knows anything about this. So you can't even bring your experience to this. You
Yeah,
can bring your experience for postpartum. We've all had family members, or at least heard enough, seen enough about it,
sure.
where
Yeah.
we can
People
sympathize.
dedicate their careers to treating it. And so, yeah.
Absolutely, but I've never even heard the word before. So he has to
No, and
treat us like
I'm
a
a
blank
women's
slate.
health specialist, so that's a very big part of my training was in that. So it's very real, but postpartum psychosis is, on the other hand, not as commonly diagnosed by like
Mhm.
a lot less, which is why I haven't figured out his total play. I'm not. I hope he has, but I haven't, and I think that's going to hurt. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to tomorrow. So
Yeah.
more from me tomorrow on the clinical insights, how this all affects the case, that and criminal responsibility, since that's really where they got to go with this. But yeah, I'm excited.
All right. We'll see you guys tomorrow.
Bye.